problem that we're facing, and why now is the important time to be introducing pretty significant changes and significant legislation in the form of the constitutional amendment. So really over the last almost a decade, we've really been drawing down on the state savings accounts, and there's really not room left to continue drawing down. You can see on the red line here that after coming down from the peak of state spending in fiscal year 15, really we've plateaued. Year over year, we're continuing to make budget reductions and put constraint on operating budgets, but the ability to make significant change just through those kind of increment-decrement actions in a budget document, that ability is not really there anymore. We have cost drivers that push up every year that we have to fight against in order to just stay flat at this level you can see here. We have had a slight decline over the last couple of years in actual spending after you account for budget increases related to things like salary adjustments or retirement payment increases and investments in public safety. But after you account for those things, it's a pretty significant amount that's had to be cut just to make up for that. The ability to fix this gap between revenues and expenditures simply through basically budget discipline, if you will, it isn't really there anymore. So we need better tools, and we need bigger changes in order to address some of these significant issues, because really we don't have the ability to continue to draw on these traditional savings accounts. And we really don't want to get into a situation where we're drawing on the earnings reserve. And that's why one of the constitutional amendments is really to protect against that in the future and to prevent this similar picture to what you're looking at here on this slide from happening to the state's other savings accounts. So another repeat from the last time, and I won't spend too much time on this, but this is just really looking at the changes that we've implemented in this year in fiscal 22 in our proposal. So one of the big changes here from prior years is that we're utilizing the entirety of the percent of market value draw for government. And even with that, even without a permanent fund dividend being taken out of that percent of market value draw, there is still a deficit. So, absent the dividend, we still have a deficit. We still have a fiscal problem that needs to be solved. You can see kind of some of the changes year over year. A lot of this is expiration of investments made in 21 to COVID response. There's about $90 million of that was in health and social services that expired. That's part of that $204 million reduction in agency operating. But there's also a lot of those smaller budget discipline, sort of grinding it out at the department level to find reductions, find vacant PCNs. Which really, those are the tools that we have at this point within just simply actions that can be taken in an operating budget. To get further is really going to require really investigating some of the bigger cost drivers and investigating some real programs within the agencies. So another repeat, but with a slight adjustment from the last time I was in front of you. One thing with the constitutional budget reserve, these balances, as the balance is being audited right now by the Division of Legislative Audit, and we work with legislative finance, this balance changes a little bit from time to time. It's actually, we found one correction that's a little more significant since I last spoke to you. So we're really looking at more of a $900 million balance and not the $1 billion balance that our estimates were showing a couple of weeks. While that's, that is a somewhat material change in terms of the balance, it really doesn't change the sort of problem of there not being enough money. It even makes it worse. It's $100 million less. So really, there's just not enough there to satisfy existing deficits with existing revenues and to continue a dividend program. So we're looking for a solution that kind of that fits all of those things together. So within that, we have a package of constitutional amendments and one statutory change associated with one, and later slides will go into detail on each of these. So SJR 5 is an amendment that will constrain spending by adjusting the existing appropriation limit. SJR 6 is constitutionalizing that percent of market value draw and protecting the entirety of the permanent fund, not just the corpus, but also trying to protect the earnings reserve as well. That's accompanied by a statutory PFD change. And then SJR 7, which prohibits the implementation of a new tax without a public vote. So it doesn't prohibit the implementation of a new tax wholesale, but it just ensures that there's a public vote should a new tax be implemented. So, on our agenda was the OMB 10-year plan. So this is really the first 5 years of the 10-year plan. Really at this stage, trying to look out 10 years is frankly a bit of a fool's errand. Really, we need to be focused on the near term with ideas of the long term and how it fits into the long term, but kind of how do we get through the next couple of years? Because, as I showed earlier on the balances, there's not really enough money in the CBR to get us through multiple years. And so we really need to be looking at how do we get through the next couple of years? How do we implement some of these changes in the next couple of years so that we can start thinking about a 10-year plan? When you look at this, this table, which is just taking the impact of those constitutional amendments, taking the impact of a couple of other changes and of those reductions that we've made, you can see there's still a deficit going into 23. And that's because the entire problem isn't necessarily solved by what we've been able to put forward. But the pieces that we've put forward, we see as the kind of most important building blocks to start with, is setting that framework and solving kind of the most contentious issue with the permanent fund dividend now, so that we can move on to the other issues and start to have some of those other policy discussions and debates, but trying to put to bed that debate over the permanent fund dividend. When you look at the agency operations line here, this is something that I think has come up quite a bit in discussions regarding the 10-year plan over the last couple of weeks. So we've projected, going into 23 and 24, further operating budget reductions. In 23, we set a target of about $50 million. And in 24, we set a target of another about $100 million off of the total operating budget. Really, these are setting targets for us to work towards. We know that they will be difficult. We know that the places that those reductions will happen will be dictated by the events over the next year of what changes can be implemented, how things, how the conditions within Alaska impact the departments and the programs they offer. Also, really, in order to meet that kind of a reduction target, we know that we'll need cooperation with the legislature, and we'll need to be able to look at actual policy proposals that change things within the agencies. That right now the agencies are really working on and focusing on the FY22 budget and the changes that we've put forward there. But we always have to have that mind for the future of what's our target, what's our goal to try to keep constraining operating budget expenditures so that there's less of a deficit elsewhere that has to be filled through other means. So going into a little bit of detail on the constitutional appropriation limit. So I'll cover some information here, then I'll hand it off to Miles to go into some detail on the other items, on the other constitutional amendments that have been proposed and for some more general discussion. But so we already have a constitutional appropriation limit. That's one thing that people that pay attention to these issues, and I'm sure everybody that's on the line here is aware that we have a constitutional appropriation limit. But why is it ineffective? Well, it was set at a base of $2.5 billion decades ago, and it's been inflated based on both population and inflation. So because of that trend, because of that inflationary aspect to that spending limit, it's almost, I would say almost comically high. The appropriation limit as it's calculated now is almost twice what we spend in a given year. So, it's completely diverged from current policy. So really looking at that, it's really just ineffective at providing any sort of meaningful constraint on state spending. So really what we looked to do was fix that calculation, is find a way to either do we rebase it, do we change the way it's calculated, do we look at some of the things that resulted in it diverging so much from reality and rebase how it escalates. So we looked at all those things and also looked at how it's interpreted with what applies to the spending limit. Our current constitutional spending limit, I would say in the years that I've been at OMB, I've seen probably 3 or 4 different ways people have assigned different costs as being applicable or not applicable based on different readings of the constitutional spending limit. So, trying to put some clarity into what it does apply to and doesn't apply to, rebasing to something a little more reasonable, and fixing the escalation so that it can't diverge into the future. And also part of this appropriation limit is it's changing the way that we access the constitutional budget reserve. Sort of changing the relationship with that state spending account from one that right now results in a lot of issues around the payback of the debt and its impact on policy, and trying to find a better way to manage that savings account, but still to retain that ability to have a savings account to go to in times of revenue volatility. So the next couple of slides are graphs to kind of illustrate a little bit about the spending cap and sort of project either backwards or forwards how that spending cap might look. If so this graph, you can see the dark black line, that's our current appropriation limit. You can see really only in 2 years in the recent past has revenue even exceeded the amount of that appropriation limit. So only in 2 years do we really even have enough revenue available to spend up to the cap. But even in that highest spending year there in 2015, you can see we didn't even come close to the appropriation limit. So it really has moved quite a good distance away from actual spending. The dotted black line represents SJR 5 if it were enacted when the current appropriation limit was. It's a little bit hard to do that kind of analysis because SJR 5 is based on a 3-year average of spending, then escalated by either the population growth or inflation. So trying to look back, you have to make a lot of assumptions about what would budgets have looked like had this spending cap been in place, because when you get into years, you can see in kind of fiscal year 4, fiscal year 5, where spending starts to tick up there and diverge away from what SJR 5 would have limited to. You have to kind of make those assumptions about how people would spend in order to escalate it forward properly. So we've sort of, in this analysis, assumed that in years where the budget was greater than this cap would have calculated, that we would have just spent to the cap. So really you can see that it is significantly more constrained than the existing spending limit. So also an important aspect of this when we're doing this kind of backward looking analysis and trying to come up with how this spending limit would have worked or would work, timing of when you implement it is very important, and that really matters in terms of how the analysis is. So if you look, the light blue line here is if it had been implemented in fiscal year 2000. Slightly darker blue is fiscal year 5, and then 10 and 15. So you can see the time period of 2000 to 2005, really state budgets were pretty flat. That was kind of the tail end of a long period of pretty stable budget within the state of Alaska. So really that timing doesn't have a huge impact on the appropriation limit. But as the budget starts to go up, 2010, your 3-year lagging average is based off of much higher budgets. So you start at a much higher level. And again, in fiscal year 15, you're looking at 3-year average based off of 3 years of some of the highest budgets the state's ever seen. And so the appropriation limit is up as well. But you can see as budgets come down, because we're basing this off of the 3-year average, it brings that spending down in line with budget reductions. And really what it's doing is it's providing constraints so that when the revenue ticks back up, budgets aren't able to just follow revenue. Because when you look at the light green and the light orange lines on this graph, which are revenue and expenditures, the actual UGF revenues and expenditures we experienced in those years, you can see as revenue went up, so did spending. And so this 3-year lagging average really provides some constraint on that growth, so that when revenue goes up, we don't implement new programs that then we're not able to respond when revenue comes down. Because as we all know, it's very difficult to make those programmatic changes once they've been implemented. So, a little more future looking, kind of back testing this is a great academic exercise, and it's very interesting to do some of that analysis. But really, what is this going to look like into the future if it's implemented now as proposed? And so you can see there's 2 different lines that we're presenting here in terms of what this might look like. The light gray line and the dark black line. So the dark black line is if spending follows OMB's 10-year plan. So if we have another 2 years of budget reductions followed by a period of just slow inflationary growth, what the spending cap would look like. And you can see that it starts a little bit higher than spending. That's because we're in a period of declining spending. So your 3-year average is greater than what we're currently projecting, because it's based off of 3 much higher years than we're moving into in 22. And then going forward, it converges with the spending line. Because if spending is flat and just gradually increasing, that 3-year average will really converge with your spending. However, if we chose to maximize spending under the cap, say we implement this cap and we say the 3-year average was, about $4.8 billion, let's spend to that cap because, we've set ourselves a limit, let's spend to the limit. What happens with that? And you can see that, if you constantly are spending to the cap, you're constantly raising that 3-year average. And so the spending limit can grow over time. So while there's a lot of constraint to the spending limit, it still does provide some flexibility in the ability to gradually grow. So there's still some ability in the out years to make some of those choices that we wouldn't want to presume now what the choices in the future will have to be. So there is still a little bit of flexibility within this appropriation limit. So moving on, I'm going to hand it over to Miles to talk a little bit about the other constitutional amendments.
Can you folks hear me?
Yep, you come through.
Neil, can you still share? Do you mind still sharing those last few slides? Is that possible?
Sorry, I didn't realize I had unshared. Sorry about that, Miles.
Okay. Thank you. Well, good morning, folks. Appreciate you guys having us on. I'm going to just talk a little bit about the last pieces of the governor's long-term fiscal plan, we have, as Neil has gone over with the changes to the existing constitutional spending limit that's in our Constitution that we are recommending changes to, we also have two additional amendments. One, Senate Joint Resolution 6 makes some amendments around the permanent fund. And in essence, we are moving the POMV endowment structure that the legislature came to an agreement on into the Constitution. It is currently a statutory construct, I think, as many of you know, and that's was a move the legislature made several years ago, and is what importantly is allowing the structured draw on percent of market value of the fund every year that I think, as Neil has indicated, is a tremendously important part of our budget now. So moving that construct into the Constitution, specifying in the Constitution that there shall be a dividend from that draw, that a portion of that draw every year shall be used for a dividend. And it would also require a public vote should the amendment pass. And I think, as Neil indicated at the beginning of the presentation, all three of these amendments, constitutional amendments, cannot go before the voters except at a general election. So the soonest these amendments, if they were passed by the legislature, could go to a public vote is in November of 22. And this amendment includes a provision as well that prospectively, once this amendment passes, that whatever program for dividends is in statute at that time, should there be changes to statute in the future that the legislature might make, that those changes would have to go to a vote of the people in order to be ratified and become law. So those are really the components of SJR 6. Under this concept, if it passes and is ratified by the voters, it eliminates the distinction between the principal and the earnings reserve and puts all of that into a single public trust that would be managed, and we would be pulling a fixed percentage from that entire trust every year to be used and to be appropriated by the legislature. And that would happen, the ERA transferring into the balance of the fund would happen at the end of FY23. One of the things we've talked about with legislators so far is, pointing out the fact that the earliest these amendments can get to the voters is 2 years. We've got 2 fiscal year cycles that we've got to get through, FY22 and FY23, where it's pretty apparent to folks that we're going to have to likely overdraw the ERA under most of the budget scenarios we're looking at. And so it just highlights the critical timeline aspects of addressing these constitutional amendments, specifically the constitutional amendment around the permanent fund this year. My personal belief is that we've got so much public education required to successfully do anything constitutionally around the permanent fund, that the sooner the legislature can get in agreement with the governor on what that amendment should look like, the better, because we need to spend a tremendous amount of time educating the public on what we're doing and why we need to do it prior to that vote coming in the fall of 22. Neil, could you forward that? The governor's plan, in addition to talking about the amendment to the permanent fund portions of the Constitution, he has introduced a statutory change as well. So under the governor's plan, the POMV concept goes into the dividend. There's a recognition that the dividend program shall exist, and there is a statutory bill that would change the current permanent fund statutes to align with that, and the POMV would be fixed at 5% of the fund's 5-year average market value. That's the current. Over the last several years, that POMV percentage has scaled down to 5%, but 5% is what at least the current statute projects would be the rate going forward. And then from that 5% draw, 50% of the funds would go to the dividend program and 50% to the general fund for public services. Both of these are very big moves from for the governor from where his policy positions were at the start of his administration. Embracing the POMV concept and his willingness to put a proposal down for consideration on a change to the dividend formula. I think, as all of you know, the biggest struggle we have in the legislature right now on the fiscal policy side is the conflict between the percent of market value draw and the dividend formula. And we have been in a position over the last several years of having to break one law or the other in order to get a budget reconciled and get out of town. And the governor has always supported, a full dividend, either change the law or follow the law, and has favored the dividend side of that spectrum. And you, of course, have other legislators and other policymakers who support the 5% draw side of that conflict and believe that that's the law that should dictate the money that's available, and that the dividend program should be driven by the money available after the rest of the public services are appropriated. So this is important that he's putting down a marker that the program needs to change. This is his starting proposal, and we see both this particular constitutional amendment as well as the statute being an important part of the conversation, which I believe may start as early as Thursday this week. The other, just a couple things in the statutory piece of this, it recognizes with changes in the statute, the Supreme Court's decision that the dividend appropriation is in fact an appropriation as opposed to being a transfer from the corporation itself. And so we make that change in here. The governor also, one of the things he's talked a lot about is the desire to have a public vote with any change. You see that reflected in the constitutional amendment, the way it's drafted, that once it passes, prospective changes to the dividend program would need voter approval. That's not the current construct. There's no constitutionally legal way to pass a bill currently that would not go into effect without the public's vote. The legislature has an ability with the governor's signature to pass law. And so this is sort of an intermediate step by putting an advisory vote in this bill. If this bill should pass and there is a formula change, whether it's 50-50 or something else that comes out of the negotiations with the legislature, this bill, if passes and signed by the governor, would go to a public advisory vote within 90 to 120 days after adjournment of this session. And what that really gives us is an ability to, I mean, it's a simple vote for the public. It's not we can't, you know, conduct an extensive survey through this voting mechanism, but we certainly will get a lot of public conversation about it and dialogue about it, and organizations like yours and the media will follow this, and hopefully we will get an indication from the voters how they feel about these changes that have been made. And we can then come back next session before that constitutional amendment would go before the voters in the fall of 22 and potentially make changes as necessary based on that public input. So that was an important part of the governor's plan on this portion. Okay, Neil, the last constitutional amendment is a prohibits the establishment of a state tax absent a vote of the people. This is written slightly different than last year's, but in essence, no new tax by the legislature without a public vote, no new tax by initiative without legislative vote. And what this really does is establish sort of an automatic referendum on new taxes, gets the public very involved, and provides sort of a check and balance on levying taxes for public purpose. Not unique. There are several states that have various forms of this. Colorado, for example, requires voter approval of new taxes and increases to existing taxes at the state and local level. Missouri requires voter approval of tax increases of $50 million or more adjusted for inflation. Washington State also requires voter approval for certain increases in real and property taxes. So this is an idea that the governor introduced last year. I think of the three, this is the one that is probably the most difficult. There's been a lot of support for spending limits over the years. The fact that we have a constitutional amendment right now that tries to address spending limit, but just doesn't work well, I think is an indication there's always been a little broad support for capping spending. We think that amendment is sort of surgical. It's a better construct than we had 2 years ago, which was a little complicated. We're trying to remember that at the end of the day, all of these have to go to the voters, and if they look at that thing in the most simplest form and they can understand, they can see where the amendments, the changes are being made, and understand them, their ability to support it, their likelihood of support goes up. And I think on the constitutional amendments side for the permanent fund, I was somebody in 2004, and my first year in the legislature was when Governor Murkowski introduced the POMV, was my first exposure to it. And my boss at the time was one of the few, I think, 4 senators that supported that. And frankly, we're just ahead of our time there. We were ahead there. The governor, the public wasn't ready for that conversation. The current governor, Dunleavy, we do not see a way you solve the permanent fund problem without a constitutional amendment. And I think the longer we pretend we can't, the longer we prevent ourselves from getting out of this quandary we're in. So spending limit, something that I think people are very interested in. Constitutional amendment on the permanent fund, something that's critically needed, and its approach and the POMV approach has been something that the Permanent Fund Board and many organizations have advocated for years. The tax limitation of the three, I'd say is the one that's the biggest lift. You know, there's pros and cons with this sort of approach. And I think I may have put a couple of those on my last slide. Did I have one more slide there, Neil? But, you know, a lot of considerations around this one. I think the legislature, or, you know, any elected body that has taxing authorities is sort of reluctant to give those up, and for good reason. And so, but I think this is something that's worth a good public conversation, and the governor thinks it's an important piece of trying to, particularly as we get into that serious conversation about what are the best and most appropriate and broad-based revenues that the state really is going to have to address going forward in the very near term. So that's, I think, Juanita, I think that was it for sort of our prepared slides, and be happy to, Neil and I, to answer questions if we can.
All right, great. Thank you, Miles. And Neil, if you want to go ahead and bring up your camera as well, we'll switch back and forth between the two of you. Again, to the audience, you can submit your questions through the Zoom chat window. And we do still have a couple of people that have not changed their screen name, so please do that. I do have a question. There's a lot of moving parts here, and for the folks listening in, many of them certainly have an understanding of the timing, the criticality of the timing of some of these pieces. So with the proposals for both statutory changes and constitutional amendments, moving forward and looking at the FY23 budget and the need for an additional $1.2+ billion in revenue, how does the timing of, for example, the constitutional amendment, the advisory vote, all of those pieces play together with, as you go into that next legislative session, the need for additional revenue and having these sort of pending pieces of either the constitutional amendments or possible legislative changes. So I think the primary interest here is that it definitely seems like the legislature will be I'm not sure if the right term would be, it just feels like there's a timing issue between some of these pieces and having the right tools in place to make decisions as you move into the FY23 budget.
I can certainly address that and then kick it over to Neil. You're absolutely right. And in fact, one of the first things that we did, even in our internal conversations about trying to understand and get, is we developed a basically Gantt chart type timeline from sort of the start of session, you know, both from, you know, what the legislation looked like, what the appropriations were, you know, what votes were required, and then, you know, what policy changes would be implemented. I mean, to me, the biggest constraint, if you will, is the November 22nd general election. One could argue that not all of these constitutional amendments have the same urgency. I mean, we think they're important to move together, and because if we miss this window, then we're into the fall of 24. So for the permanent fund, the resolution of the conflict between what the POMV statute provides us at a 5% draw and what the dividend formula determines a full statutory dividend should be. That has got to be resolved, and if it doesn't get resolved within 2 years, we will continue to face a situation where we've got the earnings reserve exposed, and the only real place we have to draw savings absent a significant new revenue measure. And the revenue measures, likely, at the size necessary would be the type of revenue measure that's unlikely to be able to be in effect until FY 23 at the earliest. So we really see action by the legislature necessary this year on a formula change and the constitutional amendment, so that we can then have the dialogue with the public in the form of an advisory vote in the fall, and the dialogue that would come around that, and then the piece of it, and then the ability to come back and make tweaks as necessary on the statute, on the formula mix, on the dividend, and then make those changes to the constitutional amendment before they go to the public vote in November of 22. Because the way it's written is, from that point forward, future changes to the dividend formula would require another public vote, a ratification vote for that law for any future law to take effect. Would require a ratification vote. So we have sort of 2 iterations on that, if you will, to try to get that right. And that is just extremely important, because in that 2-year period, we are still going to have this structural budget deficit. We'll be relying on the ERA, and we'll be fighting over the size of what's an appropriate size of the dividend.
Okay, did you have anything you wanted to add to that, Neil?
I think really Miles covered that really well. It's a lot of it's about just knowing that in these future budget discussions, there is a lot of pressure on the existing state savings accounts and the ERA, and being able to work through, in particular, that POMV constitutional amendment and bringing that in is kind of the most important, because that, like Miles said, pushing it off until 2024, it just adds another 2 years where we're experiencing those same pressures with the ERA exposed to that, that potential for continued draw, and leaving that as our only option isn't going to work out in the long term well.
Some additional questions around the thinking and the rationale of sort of the automatic referendum for new revenue measures, because of, again, I think timing, the criticality of timing at this juncture, it seems to beg the question, why institute that kind of constitutional requirement moving forward when we have a rather precarious fiscal state at this point in time, given the fact that it takes such a long lead time to implement some of the new revenue measures. Why impose that kind of constitutional requirement at this point?
Am I still on?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think that's a very good question, and I think that's a big part of the policy consideration. I do think the governor has introduced these to really push the conversation. I mean, in the budget, you'll notice in the way that Neil and his team put together the budget, we've sort of, if you look at sort of, I think about this as a spectrum of which side of the spectrum. I mean, you could, one side will say, well, we've spent the entire POMV draw on government operations, on public service, and there's nothing left for the dividend. You could have certainly structured it in a way where, you know, everything, the entire POMV draw went over to the dividend side, and, you know, we had big hole in the public service side. And those are just, you know, different ways of looking at the same problem. I think the governor has been very consistent about saying, follow the formula on the dividend, or change it. And so the way we've structured that budget, I think, puts a huge light on why that is so difficult, and why the need to address the formula is so important, and why he has been now willing to put down a starting point on the discussion of that. I think the POMV approach, which is new for him on the amendment side, is another area where we've started the conversation. I think at the end of the day, that amendment's going to, you know, there's going to have to be a decision on what that P is, what that fixed P is going to be in the dividend. There's difference of opinion on whether the 5% is too much or too little. And I think the same thing with the taxes. The taxes is something that says, you know, we want the public's involvement in this conversation about taxes. And as we've seen the pressure build up sort of around cutting government, cutting the dividend, or increasing taxes, everyone has a different view on a different place they sit, and each of those, you know, those are really the three choices we have. And we had spending savings, but the spending savings choice is gone. We've cut a lot out of the budget. It's becoming very difficult to cut more out of the budget without significant pain from the public's perspective. And so then we're down to the dividend or taxes. And so I really think the governor is just putting this down as sort of markers to really force the dialogue. And his, I think, really it's a statement more than anything that says the public needs to be involved in those conversations about taxes. And it's really meant to be broad-based taxes. You'll notice that it's a change from last year. Last year sort of addressed any tax increase, which I think in reflection and in more work over the last year realized that really hampers the legislature's ability to go in and do perhaps targeted industry taxes, or raising a gasoline tax or a tobacco tax or something like that. This is really meant to be, as we start looking at broad-based new taxes, we want the public's involvement.
To that end, do you see that the debate, this larger debate or conversation, the structure that the governor is proposing, and let me just add that the audience is expressing appreciation for the governor submitting a package to get off of high center on this statutory question between the dividend and the POMV, that we've, you know, been in this conundrum for long enough, and at least there's, you know, some proposal to try and correct the situation structurally. But given that we've got this broader debate going on about these structural changes, is there any room in the current legislative session for some kind of increase in existing taxes or new taxes, just some sort of modest revenue increases in the short run to correct what is a long-term issue?
I think the governor in his budget rollout, and I'll let Neil jump in too, but budget rollout and in his comments sense is open to those discussions, Juanita. We did not have in our December 11th rollout a specific tax proposal. I think that was as much about wanting to be cautious of where the economy was in COVID as anything, and really we were favoring more stimulus into the economy, and you'll see that in most of our ledge proposals, we had a number of ledge proposals come up from the agencies to increase fees increase, those sort of things. And we really just do not want to do that right now with the state of the economy, but he has expressed a willingness to discuss those taxes. I know there are proposals that legislators are talking about for gasoline tax, tobacco tax, those sort of things. None of which are going to fill the gap, but they're a start. So I think you'll see us engage with the legislature on those conversations. Absolutely.
You want to add to that, Neil? Neil, did you want to add to that?
So I think, yeah, just to add to that, really looking at the conditions, you know, we put the budget together and we put together these ideas that we proposed on December 11th, you know, within the conditions the state is experiencing now. You know, to Miles' point, you know, we really didn't see now as the time to implement, you know, new, you know, fee increases, things like that, that might support some of these state programs. But that wasn't because necessarily, you know, there's a, you know, absolute idea that that's not a direction that could be gone. It's just in these conditions now, it's not really available. But, you know, as we have these conversations, looking at things that may be implemented later after, you know, after the state's economy is rebounded out of the COVID recession, you know, that those are conversations that need to happen, because when you look at that 5-year plan, you know, the first 5 years of the 10-year plan, you know, there is still a pretty significant gap, even with these constructs that we've put forward implemented. So we very much acknowledge that those conversations need to happen, because that problem isn't going to go away. That problem is only going to get worse the more we kind of kick the can on some of these decisions down the road. But at the same time, we're going from sort of a financial regime of the state that's existed since the 80s of, you know, no broad-based taxes, a dividend program that was very stable in terms of, you know, following a statutory construct for a long period of time, and, you know, financing of state services that really didn't necessarily impact the average person. So that outreach to, you know, to the citizens of Alaska, you know, the public input aspects of these constitutional amendments, of, you know, the discussion of taxes, is really because, you know, we've had this stable fiscal regime from the public's perspective, but that, you know, all of us know has been not necessarily the most stable over the last roughly decade as we've been drawing down savings, you know. But for those that don't necessarily watch that bottom line number, you may not have felt that in the public. And so getting that public engagement on how we move forward with some of these ideas is important, because this is a pretty significant fundamental change in the way the state approaches its finances. You know, we had a first step in that in the POMV, you know, but I would argue that outside of sort of the group of people that really follow these issues closely, that's not, you know, not something necessarily a lot of members of the public fully understood. So, you know, Miles spoke about the educational requirements that we have behind a lot of this stuff. You know, we know that explaining to the people of Alaska, you know, what it is that we're proposing and what that future looks like is pretty important. And them having that buy-in to sort of how the public and state services interact is pretty fundamental to this entire package, and to what the choices that we have in front of us. You know, because on the spending side, you know, with that 5-year plan and looking at kind of our targets that we've set, a lot of that's going to also involve, you know, looking at how we fund programs that people amongst the public, you know, utilize. So they're not, you know, even at $150 million over the next 2 years, those aren't going to be easy choices either.
Okay, thank you for that. we do have a few other questions, and maybe we could just do a quick speed round on some of these. With regard to the spending limit, it appears to include all state funds. You presented on your slide 11 that appeared to be just UGF spending. Will the spending limit, just for clarification, apply to all state funds or only UGF?
Thank you for that. That's something I forgot to clarify as I was talking about it. So just for the simplicity of modeling the concept, we only use UGF in those graphs just because we want to show you how spending trends impact the spending limit, and just what keep it fairly simple. But the funds, it will affect all state funds. So DGF funds, though they're state funds as well. That UGF to DGF construct in state budgeting is, it's more of an organizational tool, if you will, or for analysis, but the spending limit would apply to those DGF funds as well.
Okay, and also for clarification on SJR 7, does it cover all taxes?
And so SJR 7 and Miles, I don't know if you want to hop in on this one, but it only covers the implementation of new taxes.
Okay, so increases to existing taxes would not be subject to referendum.
It's the way it's written, Juanita, and I think this is the type of thing we'll want to work through the committee process and get legislative input on. We've sort of, again, I know departmental law, and my own preference in working on these was to make these amendments as simple and surgical as possible, and really have as few words in the constitutional amendment itself, and then where necessary flesh out things in statute. But it's always a balance a little bit, because we tend to want to be super clear in the Constitution, but we're always trying to balance having that just be very, very, very high level. So the way it's written, it says the establishment of a tax, and our objective with that is new taxes, is establishment of a tax. So the establishment of a new tax, the word new is not in there, but that's the intent of that language. And it's also our intent that it really be applied to a broad-based tax that the public, the majority of the public would pay, as opposed to if the state decided to move into gaming, for example, and there was a game licensing tax that was going to be paid by operators in the gaming industry, that might not necessarily apply. So a few of those details need to be worked out, but we wanted to get the basic framework or the concept of the legislature weighing in on initiative generated taxes and vice versa.
Okay, just a couple of quick ones. Can you walk through why the advisory vote is necessary and the timing of that?
Sure. The advisory vote is really, one of the things the governor has talked about, as the senator and as a candidate and as the governor, is the importance, the real feeling that the public, for years, one of our bumper sticker mantra was, permanent fund cannot be used without a vote of the people. And I think all of us know that was really about the corpus of the fund being protected in the Constitution, and therefore to spend anything out of the corpus would require some sort of constitutional amendment. But at the same time, the earnings reserve, which is what we've been tapping for the last few years, and for many years just to pay the dividend, it's a simple majority vote. And so as we started talking about changes to the permanent fund dividend, and that's really what most Alaskans right or wrong, that's their most direct connection to the permanent fund, is that dividend. The governor's position's always been, we can't change that without the public's input, without a vote of the people. But the reality of that is, to get us from here to there, the best we can do is an advisory vote. So, I mean, we're trying to be consistent with the governor's position that we need to involve the voters beyond just through their elected representatives in this conversation. But the current Constitution and our state laws do not allow for a situation where a piece of legislation passed by the legislature and signed by the governor has yet another hurdle to go to the voters before it becomes law. And so until such time as we do that, and we intend to do that in the constitutional amendment that we're proposing on the permanent fund, the best we can do is an advisory vote. And so that's why the governor's proposed an advisory vote in the statutory change bill that would simply require, it doesn't change the law. If the legislature passes this a formula change and the governor signs it, that will become the law. But that fall, there will be a special election, there will be a special advisory vote where the public gets to weigh in on whether they think what we did was a good thing or a bad thing.
I'm going to try and just summarize a handful of questions here that are kind of just point to the concern that, well, first of all, an appreciation again for the fact that there's an effort to address some of the structural deficiencies that we have in our fiscal systems, and in moving forward and thinking about what are the tools that the administration and the legislature need to manage our fiscal future. But there's also concern that the statutory PFD 50-50 split might in fact be baking in another structural issue that the state will have to deal with in moving into the future. So any thoughts on that we're trading one structural deficiency or set of structural deficiencies for another?
I think that's a question that gets, I think, to the heart, one of the hearts of the issue. And I know Alaskans are divided on that issue in terms of where does the dividend fit into our spending priorities, and what sort of preferential treatment, if you will, it should get or not get. The governor's view on it is that the dividend's an important part of Alaskans' connection to that fund, and believes that we need to continue to keep that connection. And frankly, that we're not going to get over this hump. We're not going to get from there to here, from here to there, without ensuring that we have a dividend program that moves forward of some sort. So his position has been we should just acknowledge that. We should include it in the Constitution. I think the compromise position, if you want to look at it that way, is that his program, his constitutional amendment sets the POMV, which really determines what the draw from the fund can be, and then merely says from that there shall be a dividend program as determined by law. I think we wanted to be consistent, at least in this first proposal, that the fixed percentage of the POMV draw and the portion of that should go to the dividend should be determined by statute. That's in our proposal to start that conversation, and a 50-50 split is the start. But it's, the constitutional amendment says there shall be a dividend. What that dividend is, is for a public conversation, and everyone's got different ideas on it. But the governor's position has been that the dividend should be called out in a way that ensures that it is there as long as the permanent fund is. And as I mentioned earlier, I think the final solution will require that percent of market value to be finalized and included in the constitutional amendment. Where the public conversation goes about the dividend and the ratification requirements and those other elements, I think is all part of the conversation that we need to have.
Okay, and any final words from you, Neil?
I think just, echoing what Miles has said, this is a starting proposal and part of the discussion on how all of these elements fit into, the state's fiscal plan going forward. Just to sort of repeat what I said is, it's a pretty fundamental change, and the timing on when we need to make these changes really, is in the short term. Going back to that first slide that I show at pretty much every presentation I give is, the clock's kind of ran out on our ability to continue drawing on savings and kicking some of these hard discussions and hard decisions further down the road. So, continuing to look at what that solution should look like for Alaska and how we make all these pieces fit together in a way that works in the long term is what we're looking for.
Great. All right, well, gentlemen, thank you so much for your time today. I'm going to turn back to Cheryl for any closing remarks. Cheryl?
Yeah, thank you, Juanetta. Thank you, Neil and Miles, for joining us this morning. What's fascinating here is we've had Commonwealth North, we've had a interactive website called Budget Choices. And to date, we've received over 1,700 responses from Alaskans. And it's a site that brings together not all of the choices, but many of the choices, many of the building blocks to a budget, both on spending and revenue. And so I'm going to send you a link to it so you can review it if you haven't yet. And we'll be rolling out the responses we've received. But what's interesting is that you can't talk about the dividend by itself. It has to be in the context of other spending. And Alaskans, at least those that are responding to our survey, they get it. And so I think it's a useful tool by which we could have further community-based conversations on the choices that are out there. So I'll share with you both the site and the responses that we did roll out in December when we had over 1,100 responses. So with that, thank you everyone for joining us this morning. We really appreciate Miles and Neil's your time. We know it's typically a hectic schedule for you, but maybe with only one house in session, it's a little bit less hectic. But we'll no doubt hope to have further opportunity for interaction and conversation going forward. So thank you to you two. Thank you, Juanetta, and thank you all who joined us this morning. This Friday, we have another study group meeting with the Commissioner of Administration, who's going to follow up on some of the things that she talked to us about a year ago, I guess, in terms of some of the reforms and changes in business practices that Department of Administration is commandeering because they have relationships with all the departments. So it matters. So with that, hope to see you on Friday morning at 8 o'clock, and have a good week.
Great, and I'll just add too that tomorrow we have a program with the state of Maine, the former Secretary of State for the state of Maine, and a state representative from Maine to talk to us about ranked choice voting. That program is at noon. It is getting close to being sold out, so if you have any interest, I encourage you to go to commonwealthnorth.org and register for that, as well as for our Friday program. Thanks, everybody.